One of the biggest IPOs of 2024 is likely to be Cerebras Systems, which is a semiconductor company. On today's show, we'll go through not only what the company does, we'll go through some of the key aspects of their S1 registration statement, which was filed this past week. You're going to see a lot of headlines around this company being a competitor to potentially AMD, Nvidia, all those types of things. There'll be people that get on the financial news networks and glowingly pump and talk about it, particularly because they have ties to one of the investment banks that stand to make millions when this company goes public. We'll point out some of the things in the financials that we saw, not only on a quarterly basis, but a 6 months basis, but also some of the red flags that appear on Cerebras' financials that you have to understand before you make an investment. And of course, we'll look at the technicals of a lot of different semiconductor stocks. And we'll kick things off like we always do with the big boy, Nvidia. What is going on, investors? Hopefully you guys are doing well out there. Welcome back to the Semiconductor Show. A little bit of light week on the news front, only because most of these companies in the group that we talk about will report earnings over the next couple of weeks. Typically, when a company starts to approach earnings season, the news flows quiet down a little bit. In fact, there's a quiet period where they tend to not announce a lot of pressing press releases. They tend to save that for either during the conference call or after. Next week, we should hear from Taiwan Semiconductor and ASML. So on next week's show, we will do a preview of those earnings. But we did have a little bit of a news cross as it relates to Nvidia. The company started the week at about $120 per share, drifted upwards by about 3.27%, finished the week at $125. Now, Nvidia's CEO, Jensen Huang, he's got a little Elon Musk, a little salesman in him, and he says for demand for Blackwell is quote unquote insane. He says Blackwell is in full production. That is certainly good news for the company. And he's saying that everybody wants to have the most, basically wants to acquire the most of the Blackwell chips, and everybody wants to be first. I believe that. I believe that Microsoft and Tesla and Meta and a lot of these other AI companies, they want to have the most. They want to have this. If you are going to be one of these cloud providers like a CoreWeave or maybe even an AWS, you want to be one of the first to have Blackwell up and running from a rental perspective as well. Now, this all brings into question something that we've talked about numerous times here on the show. I don't think there's any doubt for the November read that'll mark the end of the October quarter for Nvidia that we should come in at 32, 33, 34, maybe as high as $35 billion. But we've talked about here on the show, there is a massive discrepancy as you start to look out. Look at the next quarter. Wall Street's consensus estimate is for $36 billion, but some think it could be as high as $44 billion. When you look out into the Q1, consensus is for about $40 billion, but some think that Nvidia could put up $48 billion. It gets even wider as you look into Q2 of next year. Some analysts saying as low as $35 billion worth of revenue, while some think it's as high as 53. And nothing gets as far out as when you look at Q4, which is about a year and a half from now. Some analysts thinking you might just do $25 billion of revenue at Nvidia, and some think you might do $80 billion. That is a massive discrepancy. Again, these are quarterly revenue estimates. For a full year, you might expect 10, maybe $20 billion of gap, but you almost never see this on a quarterly basis. It just means that there's a lot of uncertainty for Nvidia in terms of sales going forward. But I tell you what, Jensen Huang, who is as close to the sales total as anybody in the universe, gets up and pumps up demand every single chance that he gets. So you got to believe that Nvidia is probably going to be closer to the high end than the low end, at least if you take Jensen Huang's word for it. Now, we've got an Nvidia competitor. We'll put that in air quotes, although Cerebras does have a very viable product in the marketplace. We'll talk about what it is here in a moment. But the company have filed for a United States IPO. They're going to be filing under the ticker symbol CBRS. We don't have a lot of information on how many shares they're listing. We don't have the range or the price or the valuation or those types of things quite yet. We'll probably get those in the coming weeks, and I'll certainly keep you updated on that. But what you are going to get is a lot of press releases in the financial news and on financial news sites that says something like this: Cerebras Systems filed to go public. What does it mean for AMD, Intel, and Nvidia? And we'll show you here from a revenue perspective, it probably doesn't mean anything for Nvidia, as they are putting up massive numbers from a revenue perspective on a quarterly basis. In fact, their quarterly revenue is higher than most of these companies are putting up on a yearly basis. But I read through the probably 100-page document. That is the S1 registration statement, so you don't have to, although maybe I'll put a link down below if you want to dive into it. Now, what does Cerebras do? They're known for having what is called a wafer scale or a wafer size chip. So typically, and I'm sure most of you guys know this, but typically semiconductors are made on these large wafers. Sometimes they are these squares. Sometimes I see them kind of more as a circle shape. And what happens is they get diced up or cut up on these wafers. What Cerebras has decided to do is actually not cut up the wafer, and they create these large wafer style semiconductors. So it's just this big chip that the company makes. And then what they do is also somewhat interesting, a little bit different than what you see over at Nvidia and certainly AMD and maybe Intel as well, is they put it in what they call their engine block. And so this engine block fits this large wafer chip, and in here is cooling technology, power technology, some networking technology as well. Typically Nvidia, they can provide some of this for you, but typically like a super microcomputer or an Intel integrates this to you, or if you're a big hyperscaler like Amazon or Microsoft, you might be doing some of this stuff internally yourself. So Cerebras is creating kind of a data center in a box, and it's far more approachable for sovereign governments, for example, that might not have big IT staff, might not have the expertise to scale up and put together an entire Nvidia type setup. Well, they can get this type of setup, and for the most part might be a little bit more approachable, a little easier. And in fact, Cerebras has a major customer in a sovereign government, and that would be the United Arab Emirates. This is a G42 backed company, which we'll talk about more here in a second, has a very key relationship with Cerebras, not only a key customer, but also an investor. But they built this gigantic supercomputer called the Condor Galaxy. And what was interesting is G42, which again is a sovereign backed company in the United Arab Emirates. They do a lot of things around AI. They're trying to advance AI in that region. And this company built this supercomputer, and they're using it for their own internal things, using it inside of the country, using it for all different types of projects. But what was interesting is Cerebras is able to take the excess capacity on these things and actually rent some of it out and actually generate some revenue. Now, they're advertising that it's faster than some Nvidia setups and other supercomputers. They're advertising that it's better at optimizing different types of things. But I just thought it was really interesting that Cerebras was able to find a partner, build this supercomputer, create some test cases, get a customer, get some revenue, and they're also able to essentially rent some of this space out as well. Now, from a revenue perspective, it's been explosive for Cerebras over the past quarter over quarter. Back in the March quarter of 2023, just $3 million worth of revenue. It is now scaled up to about $5.8 billion. This was in the June of last year, basically a year ago. And then you had a gigantic leap to $35 million in December of last year. And then more recently, the last two quarters, the first 6 months of this year, you went to $66 million up to $70 million in the most recent quarter. Now, the company is not profitable, not yet on a quarterly basis. Net loss in the most recent quarter off of $70 million in revenue was about $51 million. Some things that I do notice that are a positive, you do see total operating expenses that actually stayed in a range. It was $54 million back in March of last year, and it was actually $54 million in the most recent quarter, despite exponentially higher revenue. So that's a good sign for Cerebras. On a more detailed view, the far left-hand column, this is a 6 months view, the first 6 months of 2024. My apologies, I've cut off the top part that would have said this is for the first 6 months. So the revenue came in at about $136 million compared to just $8.7 million last year. Notice that your research and development down here in operating expenses, basically stayed flat year over year. It was 76 million last year, and it was 77 million in the most recent quarters. So that's actually a really good sign. Sales and marketing went up a little bit from 4 million up to 7 million, and that's a big jump. Okay, it's almost 100% jump, but look at your revenues. Again, they went from 87 up to $136 million. So you had a big jump in revenue, and not a lot on the sales and marketing side, not a lot on the research and development side. One thing I'm a little concerned about is the general administrative went from $5 million up to $12.9 million. And you got to expect when this company goes public, they're going to need accountants, they're going to need lawyers, they're going to need all those types of things. So this is the cost that I think probably has to scale up even more. Your total operating expenses over the last year didn't go up a lot. 85 million up to 97 million. That shrunk your losses from operations from 81 million down to a $41 million loss. The good news is with Cerebras Systems, this isn't like a late stage IPO by Uber. This isn't a late stage IPO by some of these companies like Instacart or some of these other companies out there. This is still a very early stage IPO where the revenue is still ramping drastically. The operating profits are still not existent, but if you believe that the revenue is going to continue to expand, well, you're getting in early. This is like buying some of the stocks back in the dot-com age. This would maybe even be like buying Nvidia and maybe AMD when it was on its back several years ago. You were actually getting in early. So this will be an IPO, not one that I'm going to be rushing out to buy into, but it would be one I'm looking at very, very closely. Because when you can get in early like this, man, you can have some exponential turns if this company can obviously grow in size. Now, some concerns in the S1 is that the company generated this $136 million worth of revenue in the most recent quarter, which I showed you here, again, compared to about 8.7 from a year ago. So a gigantic leap in revenue over the last year. However, the single customer, G42, which is the United Arab Emirates-backed AI company, the single customer, G42, was responsible for 83% of the company's revenue in 2023 and 87% of this $136 million. So if it wasn't for the United Arab Emirates being an incredibly wealthy country and deciding to throw tens of millions, and in this case, $100 million or more into Cerebras, well, this company would be nowhere. And so if Abu Dhabi finds a new customer, there's also a little bit of risk factor, which they discussed in the S1. G42 had ties to China. And as you know, following this show and the semiconductor business, is that the current administration under Joe Biden, and we'd have to assume probably would carry forward into a Vice President Harris administration and maybe even potentially forward into a President Trump administration, is you have those restrictions, those export controls on semiconductors. Nvidia can't sell its products into China without modifying them. And in the case of G42, they had ties to China, and in that case could have potentially slowed the sales of Cerebras Systems, which are also would fall under the export restrictions into the country of China. So G42, for its part, earlier this year, said they divested away from their China investments. But again, you never know when it comes to the United States government. At a stroke of a pen, 87% of this company's revenue could be under pressure. Now, according to the filing as well, G42 committed purchasing about $1.43 billion from Cerebras. This was back in May of 2024, which will be prepaid before February of 2025. So some of these sales that are coming in for the company is probably portions of prepayments. And over the next couple of months, the company will probably see exponential growth from the revenue side as G42 continues to prepay this $1.4 billion worth of product that they've committed to buy. Now, the filing states that $350 million is to come from a university in Abu Dhabi. So hand it to Cerebras for getting this deal with Abu Dhabi, with the United Arab Emirates, getting some of that oil money, if you will. It certainly has bolstered up their revenue, but it also comes at a risk. If that money dries up, if the money is subject to sanctions going forward, well, this company would absolutely be on its back. And so we'll see how the market digests this. This is certainly some of the most known information. People that discuss this company will certainly be discussing this relationship. If it gets discussed at length and investors decide to stay hands off, well, it could push down the valuation of this company, and it could create some opportunity to come in and make an investment. Certainly when this one goes public, we get pricing and all those types of things. We'll cover it more in depth at that time. Now, moving over to the technical segment, things are looking absolutely beautiful. The SOXX ETF has bounced off a very logical, we have a purple trend line, which is kind of the longer term trend line. Our shorter term trend line is still intact, or intermediate trend has really been intact since October of 2022. We are making our way back to the middle of the channel. What you'd really like to see is a push all the way to the top of the channel. That would take you north of probably 275 on this one, at least in the shorter term. The SMH also looking beautiful. It made a pit stop in the middle of the channel, which is why we often dissect these channels, because they tend to find support and resistance somewhere in the middles of these channels. This one looks like, to me, it wants to retest a new high, probably up here at 287, meaning you still have about $40 in upside there. Nvidia is still looking really, really good, although we have not confirmed a new higher high. We are still confirming higher lows on this one. You are consolidating, and when you do this and you come to these points or these flagging formations, you tend to break one way or another on this one based on the other technicals that we're seeing, and based on this longer term and intermediate trend. You'd actually have to assume Nvidia will break to the upside. If you do that, the 160s are probably in play with Nvidia. AMD looking very similar to Nvidia. The fact that we have an intermediate trend, a long-term trend, both of those are intact. The micro trend, though, is still lower highs, although we've kind of peeked our head over some resistance here at 160. This one looking still rather strong. Broadcom basically hovering at all-time highs. No real reason to believe this stock is going to give up those gains anytime soon. Intel has found some footing. We'll have to switch this back to kind of a weekly view on Intel. It did find some footing down here in the $20 range. As you are aware, a lot of companies stepped in and made some bids, or there were some rumors of some bids for either parts of Intel or all of the company. And so you have to imagine there is a floor, at least on the valuation in the shorter term, for Intel until they report their earnings. That's the kind of the rub with Intel, is you've got to figure when the company reports their earnings, it could create a downward pressure on shares, and they will report, like most of these companies, the third week of October, on October 24th. You have Qualcomm just confirmed a new higher high. It's hanging out just above the middle of the channels. If you get pullbacks in Qualcomm down into the 140s, that could create a buying opportunity. You won't get Qualcomm earnings until the first week of November. Taiwan Semiconductor also just more recently confirmed a new higher high. Taiwan Semiconductor, usually one of the first companies to report of this group. We should hear from them on October 17th. ASML, also a company we'll hear from very soon, is actually in the middle of the channel. These are areas where if you do want to make an investment in ASML, this is an area, although I tend, with earnings so close, just 10 days away on Wednesday, October 16th, I would tend to just wait until that day and see if you get confirmation one way or another. If you do get confirmation of higher highs, well, you still have got upside into probably close to 1200 on ASML. NXP still looking really good. This one's religiously been creating higher highs, higher lows. It's really kind of at a low point. If you do like to buy this one, you could do it here, hoping for another higher high back up into the 290s. That would be about $60 upside. You'll hear from this one the first week of November. We've got ARM Holdings, which we tend to have to ship back to a daily view, although I guess I'm on that. In the micro trend that we're making a beautiful series of higher lows, higher highs. We're starting a new upper channel on this one. Complicating the situation is you do get earnings on this one sometime the first week of November. You've got Super Micro Computer still making a series of very steep lower highs and lower lows. That's otherwise known as a downtrend, and in this case, a falling knife. You don't want to catch falling knives, particularly when the company reports their earnings about 23 days from now on October 29th. That'll be a highly anticipated earnings report, and we'll see if we get the annual report before they report their quarterly earnings. DELL has just been hanging out at the top of the channel here. You won't hear from DELL until I think after Supermicro, or right around the same time, right about Tuesday, October 26th. Micron, after reporting their earnings, has found footing in the middle of the channels. What you would like to see with this one, particularly if you bought it more recently, is to create a new higher high up in the 160s. That would still be, believe it or not, 50% upside on this one. Obviously, as they just reported earnings, you won't hear from them again until the December timeframe. You had Lam Research. Maybe they did some kind of split, because I noticed my technical chat patterns on Lam Research have gone completely haywire. So they must have done some kind of stock split more recently, but it really doesn't change anything about the technicals other than the price. This one has more recently created another higher high, and this one looks absolutely beautiful. Really nothing to worry about technically there. And finally, Applied Materials also looks good. Found footing in the middle of the channels. Again, this is why you want to divide your channels in half. Put yourself on a log scale. Find the bottom of the channel, then you can find the top. Typically, the bottom of the channel is more clear than the top. Don't be as precise at the top of the channel as you want to be at the bottom of the channel. And then go ahead and try to slice these in the middle. And what you're going to find is oftentimes you find support and resistance in the middle. And that's what we found in Applied Materials. A new higher high on Applied Materials, which should come probably in the next couple of weeks. Could take you back up into the 250s. Stocks currently at 203. Folks, that was, I guess, a shorter semiconductor show this week, but it has nothing to do with laziness. The fact that we are moving into earnings. It is a little bit of a quiet season, and we've got to buckle up, because October and the first couple of weeks of November are big weeks as investors. Be prepared. Stay close to your phone. I know we've got football. We've got playoff baseball. We've got NBA starting later this month. But we've got all of these major companies reporting earnings as well, and we want to be keeping you up to date on all of that. Next week, we'll preview some of the companies that will report the following week, and we'll keep you up to date as the earnings cross. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Newsletter links down below. Hit that like button. Share the video if you can as well. Thanks for all the support, the comments, and everything, and I'll see you again next week. Good luck with your investments.